Regine Paul and Emma Carmel. Regine Paul is an associate professor in the Department of Administration and Organization Theory at the University of Bergen, whose research focuses on the mutually constitutive interaction of institutions, values, and classification in public policy governance, as well as their implications for those governed. From a comparative perspective, her work is broadly situated in interpretive and critical policy analysis and inspired by a Bordesian view on categorization and symbolic power, as well as cultural political economy and its focus on the mutual coevolution of material structures and norms. Her empirical expertise is in migration governance, risk analysis, and risk regulation, and the use of artificial intelligence technologies in public administration. Emma Carmel, on the other side, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at University of Bath, and her research focuses on governance analysis as a new approach to the interpretation of public policy, the governance of migration, labour market, and social policy in the UK and the EU, and the political sociology of the European Union. They are going to unravel today the digital common marketplace myths and discuss about the colonial political economy of AI governance and the European Union. I think Regine will start.
Yes, thanks so much. I hope you can hear me. Can you all hear me? Great. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to start, and then Emma's going to finish off our presentation. And we apologize for not having prepared a beautiful PowerPoint presentation. We thought since the goal was to hand in a statement, we keep it a bit more statement-y and present what we have to say in that format. I'm going to time myself so that I don't steal so much of Emma's time. And start off. Now, as Samina said, Emma and I are social scientists and critical policy analysts, and what has united us over the last couple of years really is an interest in EU governance at large, and also its governance of migration policy making in particular, and more recently, Emma and I have also started working on AI. So our statement here really focuses on the EU's regulatory approach to AI, which is quite recent, and we will say a couple of things about what makes it special from the EU's perspective as well. And we really want to expose the rhetoric that surrounds that AI regulatory strategy. And we want to expose it to a critical reality check, really, developing what we would call a colonial political economy of AI governance in Europe. And that's really a research agenda that we are trying to build up together. So we're really interested in your feedback on how valuable it is for us all to think about AI and how it's regulated. Now, shortly after taking office in December 2019, the new EU Commission's president, Ursula von der Leyen, promised to develop the world's first set of binding rules for trustworthy AI in the EU. She spoke, and I quote her, of reaping the benefits of technology and making it work for people. So that ambition was already expressed in the AI strategy that the EU published in 2018, when it said that the EU can lead the way in developing and using AI for good and for all, building on its values and its strength. Now, you're also familiar with the GDPR, and the rhetoric surrounding that regulation has been similar. So it's really about building trust, creating a so-called sustainable approach to technology that can create, and I quote again, a competitive edge for the EU, while also building on its values. So this is really the starting point for Emma and I to say, here's a duality, it seems, of regulatory goals in the EU's emergent AI regulation. It has just proposed a regulation, and it has to go through Parliament and the Council and all of that, and it might be adapted in 2022 and implemented in 2023. We don't know yet, but the proposal has this duality of goals. On the one hand side, the Commission wants to mitigate AI-related risks, some of the risks that scholars here have already mentioned in quite detail, and it expresses that in terms of trust, ethical principles, fundamental rights. And on the other hand, there is a very strong and explicit focus on developing market leadership for the EU in this wider geopolitical economy of AI technology, competing really with the US and China on that. And in brackets, really, this may be typical of the EU also in other fields, not just AI. If you think of the Green Deal agenda, it's kind of a similar rhetoric of leading green growth, the kind of moral high ground, but also being competitive with these new technologies. Now, in our statement, really focusing on AI, we take that rhetoric as a starting point for critically examining the narrative of ethical innovation and competitiveness. Because the kind of underlying assumption in the rhetoric is that they are mutually beneficial and that they're kind of equally weighted, and everyone is better off basically after the EU regulates AI. And of course, we could just kill that whole debate by saying this is basically ethics washing, as Allison mentioned earlier. But we think that there's actually more to the narrative, and that we can gain from looking at critical and especially colonial political economy in particular to understand that. So really our statement situates this trustworthy AI agenda in the EU's founding myth. So we're going back historically to see how the EU has perceived or conceived of itself. And we discuss how existing scholarly accounts of AI regulation in the EU nourish and kind of buy into that narrative or that interpretation of what the EU was founded on. And we then go on to problematize that. So in terms of the historical continuity, our statement tries to, or makes the claim that that narrative of trustworthy AI really taps into the founding myth of the EU. Robert Schumann's, former French foreign secretary, one of the founding fathers of the EEC, famous vision of peace and prosperity. So the famous Schuman Declaration in the 40s spoke of peace and prosperity as the twin kind of considerations of the EU and mutually supportive goals of European integration. This is why the 6 founding members came together, arguably. So the idea was that in order to secure peace in Europe after 2 devastating world wars, Europe had to unite economically, and that these two would go hand in hand and deepen integration. Now, we think, or we make a claim that the dominant self-representation of the EU's AI Act and data protection regulation as standing in that heritage of peace and prosperity, of human rights, moral leaders, but also economic leadership is a useful starting point. But we want to revisit this claimed heritage to really expose a more ambivalent set of relationships between market making, power, the political economy of regulation, and these kind of moral claims for trustworthy AI. And we think that that revelation is important for understanding what the EU really does when it regulates AI governance. Now, just a word on this common critique in political economy, because it's, the colonial approach that we want to describe next is not the first critical approach, of course, towards the EU's regulation of AI. There's a lot of critical legal scholarship that has also been shared in this workshop. And there's also a common critique in kind of more mainstream political economy that the relationship between normative claims about regulation, so trustworthy AI, and the competitiveness agenda is not really equally weighted. Now, while Schuman in the past might have suggested that economic integration is a means to ensure peace, it now seems that trustworthy products, including AI, but also GME-free food or emission-reduced flights have become a competitiveness brand, really, for the EU in global markets. So regulation scholars such as Anu Bradford, for instance, describe the EU basically as a regulatory imperial power that uses restrictive regulation of products, high-quality products, basically, to shield itself against competition from other global players. So in a way then, human-centered AI or trustworthy AI for Europeans at least could be seen even as a byproduct of that competitiveness strategy, if one were to be cynical, right? But we think that there's more to that view, to that view of regulatory domination than mere economic rationalities. And we think in particular that to draw on colonial political economy helps us to highlight that EU market making is also about longer standing patterns of domination, longer standing ways of being competitive in a global market. And in particular, we draw on the work of two Swedish scholars here, P.O. Hansen and Stefan Jonsson, who have written a beautiful history of colonial history of European integration, where they argue that when Europe came together with the Treaty of Rome in the 50s, one of the key purposes for uniting economically and to remain competitive globally, one key mechanism was to pool colonial resources at the time, because France, Belgium still held their colonial resources, their colonial territories at the time. So their argument is that we can't really understand European integration and market making without understanding the role of colonies and colonial domination. And similarly, sociologist Kuminda Bambra has recently written an approach for colonial political economy, and is arguing that we can't really understand capitalism at large without understanding the global connections forged through colonialism, the conditions that made capitalism possible in the first place, basically. And this, of course, relied on dispossession and destruction of indigenous and colonized peoples, but it also, as Fanon argues, these colonialist projects also always involved misrecognition and disavowal of the project itself, right? So disguising the condition of colonialism as a project so that it could continue, basically. And this is also partly the argument of Hansen and Johnson when they talk about why the colonial heritage of European integration got forgotten over time and nobody speaks about it anymore, even though it was really central at the time. And policymakers are on record talking about the role of colonies in furthering the European market. So our point here really is that colonial political economy is useful and should be used more for exploring how the EU efforts in creating an AI market on which it self-competes might not only express a particular competitiveness strategy, but also builds on and reproduces global patterns of domination, exploitation, and geopolitical influence. And I'll leave the floor now to Emma to talk about some key lines of analysis that we want to develop based on that perspective.